Okay, well, welcome to the annual Speakers Forum that's organised by EnviroHub. And our speaker is Julian Fitter. And Julian is a naturalist, a conservationist, a writer, a lecturer with a particular interest in New Zealand wildlife and island systems. He has spent 15 years in a rather remote part of the world in terms of the Galapagos Islands, where he established and ran the first yacht charter operation, and then since moving to New Zealand has become an ambassador for native wildlife, being involved in many aspects of conservation in the country and the driving force behind the Makatu Ongatoro Wetland Society. He is also chair of the Bay Conservation Alliance, and his topic today matters related to biodiversity. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you, Julian, and I'm delighted you could be part of this Speakers Forum.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Yeah.
And so perhaps if I kick off and we dive into that broad topic of biodiversity, and perhaps if you can outline in your view what is it and why it's so important to all of us, but also in particular to the Waiariki Park region, which is a piece of that overall puzzle.
Bill, sorry, I lost the first bit. The communication was down. For some reason, you froze that first bit of that question.
Okay, I'll go through it again.
Yes, I think yes. Yeah.
I'll just turn up things. So, in terms of that, the broad topic of biodiversity, perhaps Julian, if you can outline from your point of view, what is it, why it is important to all of us, and in particular, why it is important to the Waiariki Park region, given it's a piece of that overall biodiversity puzzle.
Yeah, well, I guess, kia ora, Bill. I guess the biodiversity is a sort of fairly recent term that's been brought up to encompass everything of the environment that surrounds us. And I suppose the idea behind biodiversity is that we have a lot of different species in there. The diversity of biology, I guess, is what it means. And I would in the New Zealand position, I find it one of the issues that we come against with biodiversity is that New Zealand has a very distinct biodiversity of its own. We are unusual in having a very large percentage of our native animals and plants found only in New Zealand. They're endemic. And so I would like to say, when we're talking about biodiversity in New Zealand context, I would like to talk about native biodiversity, because I think that is the important part. There's lots of other biodiversity around. We have enormous, as anybody who's done any work in the environment will know, we're surrounded by weeds at all times. Anybody who's in the agricultural, horticultural sector in the Bay of Plenty will know a lot about weeds. They're really a very dangerous and economically damaging pests. And of course, we know about the other pests, the rats and the stoats and the weasels and the possums, and they're all part of biodiversity, but they're not actually the sort of biodiversity we really want to encourage. So I think we need to focus, if we can, on native biodiversity. And also, I think we need to accept that we're really talking about the environment here, and that I think it's pretty well understood that the healthier your environment, the more natural your environment, the better it is for the people living in it. Quite apart from the fact that the environment supports everything that we do. If we want to have any agriculture or horticulture, we need the environment. We need things like soil and sunshine and wind and rain to enable us to do that. So while the agricultural sector is dealing largely with species that have been imported here, they still need that native biodiversity and that whole environment to support that operation. So the two, you might say, are entirely interlinked and intertwined, and you can't easily separate them out.
So in terms of the Waiariki Park Region Initiative, how do you see that contributing to protecting, enhancing biodiversity?
Well, I think that anything that raises awareness is good. I think that really bugs me all the time is that we have a real problem in the Bay of Plenty with pampas grass, and yet you'll ask 95% of the people you ask will not know that, will think it's toi toi, a native grass, which looks quite similar, but it isn't. And that is one of the issues that I think that, you know, we need to focus on, and at this time of the year in particular, because every time I drive down the TEL, I see these great masses of pampas waving, and they're actually starting to take over some of the plantings that the NZTA have put in place along that motorway, and you see more and more of these weed plants coming in, and there simply isn't an awareness enough of the issue of weeds in our environment. There's a lot of awareness, I think, about rats and stoats and possums, but there's not a lot of awareness about the weed problem, and that's where I see the Waiariki National Park thing. That's one of the areas that I think it could really work in, raising awareness. You can do it in your own garden, but lots of people have weeds growing in their own garden. There are a lot of species that are garden plants which, once they get out of the garden, become a pest plant, become a weed. And so those are the sort of things if we can raise the awareness, people understand that this is actually maybe a pretty flower in the garden, but outside the garden it's a real pain. You know, Montbretia is a good example of that. People quite like, it's a lovely flower in the garden, but it's actually, once it gets out into the wild, it's really difficult to get control and quite expensive to control. And there are a number of other plants like that, which people say, you know, oh, evening primrose, lovely, but, you know, very difficult to get rid of at times. And so we need to be just a bit smarter. You know, we're supposed to be Homo sapiens, we're supposed to be wise, yet we don't actually very often, we have lost that ability we've lost that link with the environment, partly, I guess, because a lot of us live in an urban environment. And so our links with the natural environment are only when we go out into it, but most of our life is in an urban environment.
Well, and perhaps that's quite a nice entree into the next question, in terms of how does biodiversity improve our physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being?
I think I'm probably not the expert to answer that one particularly, but I think anybody will know that, you know, a walk in the bush is quite relaxing. As it may be strenuous at times, but you know, sit in silence in a green area is a relaxing thing. I think anybody, it's not rocket science. It's common sense, really. That's why people have gardens, because they like sitting in them and seeing the flowers and things like that. So a natural environment is a relaxing environment, and especially, as I said, most of us live in towns and cities, and those are, I would say, not very relaxing environments. There's a lot of noise, smell, things are happening all the time. Whereas out in the environment, you're able to sit down and relax. And I think, you know, any you know, professionals who working in this area, and I'm sure there are studies on it to show as well, will agree that a natural environment, the better your natural environment, the more relaxed you can be, and being relaxed is obviously good for your general health.
You touched on it earlier on. Be interested in terms of why our endemic species are so unique. You outlined that we have a high percentage of such species in New Zealand. So it would just be interesting if you could share some thinking around the uniqueness of those species.
Yeah, I think one of the things there are two things I think on that sort of particular front of what's so special. One of the features of New Zealand wildlife is with the birds, especially the ones that are extinct now, but also some of the ones we still have, as their flightlessness. And so that was a big feature, and one of the reasons we've lost something like 50 species of birds since man came to New Zealand. We lost something like 40 species before Captain Cook arrived, but then obviously he bought some extra technology, and we've managed to get rid of another 10 or so. And so we've been extremely efficient at getting rid of species, and a lot of them were flightless. And obviously easy meat for anybody hunting them, easy meat for mammalian predators like cats and rats and dogs. So that's one of the issues that we have. So the flightlessness of some of our bird species. The other thing that I think most people don't appreciate is our bush. For the most part, it is an evergreen temperate rainforest, which is a very unusual ecosystem in the rest of the world. You know, you go to the northern hemisphere, go really far north, and it's all evergreen Arctic sort of pine forests and the like. But most of the outside of the tropics, most of the areas tend to have deciduous trees, which lose all their leaves in the winter. We have only about 3 species of tree that lose their leaves in the winter. And yet we have something like 700 species of trees and shrubs in New Zealand. So we have a huge variety of plants that are found only here. And we have an amazing, they are remarkably, distinct in being evergreen. And I think it's a thing that always annoys me, actually. When you go anywhere in the agricultural areas, I've been recently to, I think is it the Waikiki Valley, the other side of Rotorua? And it's quite difficult to see a native tree. And it's amazing the efficiency of which we have managed to destroy get rid of most of the native trees and plant non-native trees, so that they're, you wonder, why was this the case? And I remember talking, must have been 10 years ago, to a farmer down in the Catlins, and he said, yes, his father spent 30 years cutting down native trees, and he's spending most of his time planting them. So we have actually maybe started to turn a corner, but we don't always it's still amazing to me, the number of non-native trees that are planted, especially in the agricultural sector. Still, you still see rows of poplars being planted and things like that. And yet I'm quite certain there are pretty good native trees that you could use instead of those. And yet we haven't got that mindset. Hey, look, native trees, they're probably much better at fixing carbon apart from anything else, because that's become an issue that we really need to think about. So we need to appreciate what we have here, that, your garden doesn't have to be full of lots of foreign species. We do have some quite nice ones here in New Zealand. And my garden's got, some nice fruit trees and things like that in as well, but I try to keep as much native stuff in there, because if you have the natives, that brings the native birds and insects as well. And if you want the native bird species, then you do have to have native tree species. The big issue in Auckland at the moment about the chopping down of non-native trees on the Maunga, I would say go to it, because those non-native trees will not be attracting native bird species in any great number. Whereas if you plant up the native trees, which generally speaking grow very, very well and quite quickly, you will get your native species back. And I think the Zealandia in Wellington is a very good example of that. When you have the native tree species there, you get a huge amount of native wildlife coming.
Yeah. Well, we have a kauri in our front yard, which is probably about 35 to 40 years old. And it's interesting, and over a period of time, the increase in tuis and the like of actually coming to that tree.
Yeah, no, they did. I mean, I'm really impressed with it, where you've got native trees. We have a couple of puriri in the garden. They may have to be chopped down one of these days because they get rather large at the end of the day, but they attract the tui and especially the kiruru, the pigeon. That's very, very, we're common visitors here, and that's partly because we have food. We have food for them. If you put the food out, on the whole, if you put bird food out in New Zealand, you'll get non-native species. The native species are not very well adapted to European bird food, sort of thing. But if you want the house sparrows and the blackbirds and the miners, yes, then you put out food and you'll get them. But the natives do like to have sort of native plants, native trees is the ideal.
Just going back to your earlier comment, where you observed generally non-native species grown in rural areas and farming areas and that type of thing. What would you see as key to changing the mindset and appreciation of people to actually plant natives and that range of
I
species.
suspect it needs, I mean, education is obviously the key, but at the same time, it almost needs to be government or regional council policy being used in that to encourage people, because there's no doubt that a lot of, you know, for instance, the regional council has made a lot of progress with planting up of stream banks, river banks, and planting natives along the streams. But only by offering a sort of a benefit, you might say, A, the advice, but B, I think they subsidize the costs involved in that sort of thing. So it may be that we need a concerted effort from, you know, from outside, but also I would think, you know, we need to talk specifically to people like Federated Farmers, to the organization which represent farmers, because it's much easier for somebody from that sort of organization to go and talk to their members and say, hey guys, look, why don't we do this, that and the other? Whereas if I come from outside and say, hey guys, look, I think you ought to be doing this or that, it's much less likely to be acceptable. But if we can get the organizations representing the farmers and the horticultural sector on board, then I think that's maybe the way. And if there's a little bit of a push from regional council and even from government to say, look, this is what we're trying to do, we need native, you know, if it's part of the carbon neutral program, yeah, that you get a credit of some sort for planting native trees, then I would have thought that would be the way to go, because I think there is quite considerable concern about the idea of we could plant our way out of the carbon situation by planting pine trees, which we know grow and then they are fairly short-lived. Whereas a lot of the natives, some of the natives are quite short-lived, but the major species of native tree are very long-lived indeed. And that kauri in your backyard, Bill, will be around long after, if it's allowed to be, it'll be long after tongue has disappeared, I suspect.
Yes. Yeah. It'll be someone else's issue to look after. So actually, and just moving now on to what do you see are some of the main pressures and drivers of change to the biodiversity in our region? And you've touched on, you know, the change of the landscape and farming and that type of thing. I'd be just interested in terms of teasing that out a bit further.
Well, I think the other thing we need to do, I mean, one of the areas that, you know, as chair of Bay Conservation Alliance, one of our key things that we support, our members are much smaller, you know, small community groups around the region. But one of the real things we're looking for is what is now known as landscape scale projects. Because, you know, if I fix a little thing in, you know, down by the stream, down my, you know, below my house, or if we do protect a couple of hectares of native bush or something really nice, but not actually making a major difference to the overall picture. So we need to start thinking bigger. We need to start, and that's one of the reasons why bringing groups together, if we can start, and the Waiariki National Park is a good example in one respect, that it's actually talking about the region, not just this little bit over here, but actually talking about the whole region, that we need to start looking at that as a unit and saying, and not saying, okay, look, we've got a nice little bit here. Oh, look, we've got a nice bit of forest at Taumanuku and a nice bit up at Angateti, but we need to, you know, everything else in between is a bit of a mess. We need to start looking at those bigger projects. And of course, one of the really exciting ones at the moment is the Manaki Kaimamamaku project, which is with the trust, which is developing for the whole of the Kaimamamaku ranges. And that's the sort of thing we need to get, you know, to be supporting and developing. I mean, there are big problems, quite apart from the fact that the Kaimai ranges are really, really tricky to get into. You know, there's a lot of very difficult terrain there, which makes it extremely difficult to. But there are other people there with interest, the deer stalkers, the hunters, and the like. So we've got to try and find a way that's going to accommodate all the different people in society and their different views, and we only actually do that by sitting down and talking about it. But I think if we can focus on getting bigger projects, I mean, here the work we do in Makatu, we're actually, you know, we are, if we can, and we're looking to work with the Runanga here as well on it, you know, we've got 4 or 5 projects around Makatu Harbour and Little Waihi Harbour, and if we really want to look at we ought to be looking at the whole harbour. In fact, join the two harbours up together. They're all part of the same ecosystem. I live on the flyway between the two harbours, so we see a lot of gulls and other species going back and forth all the time. So we know the two are ecologically linked, essentially. They are, and so we need to start looking at that, and we need to say, right, look, the important thing is that we start working together with other groups, and I really, really sincerely believe that working together is got to be the mantra over the next 50 years if we're going to make any real progress. If we don't work together, you know, we don't have a chance. If we work together, it's a big job, but I think we have a chance to do it. And we need to bring everybody on board. We need to bring the farming community on board in particular, because, you know, that's an important part of it. One of the things I've always said, you know, I think you can't just try painting things green. You've got to show that the environment is valuable to the economy. You've got to show that we have, you know, by doing this, we actually benefit the economy or benefit society in some way, not by just making it nicer and, you know, preserving that particular animal. We've got more kiwi or more kokako. We do really have to say, right, this is actually all part of our economy, you know, and we need to treat it as such and not say, oh, that's just a piece of bush, we'll just chop it down. That has a value. We need to look at that. So
that collaborative, joined up approach that you've just advocated, do you see a key to that, given the range of parties that are involved in terms of contributing to improving our biodiversity and the like? Do you see them actually then having some ownership of the issues and matters to be to be worked on and improved?
Yeah, I think that word ownership, Bill, is quite tricky. I think that's one of our problems, that we bump into ownership. Yeah, I mean, I admit sometimes on occasion I've been upset when somebody has been on my spit or doing something on my spit without telling me. You know. But we've got to look at what the objective is. We're trying to preserve the environment, to improve the environment, and actually, you could say to save our species. You know, we do need to improve this environment because we know that if we keep on letting it get worse and worse, it will be more and more difficult for us to survive in the climate, especially with climate change and sea level rise and things like that. So I think we have to say, look, ownership is all very well, but actually, it's what about your responsibilities, actually? And I'd say, you know, I think it's one of the dangers I've bumped into with small groups is they're often passionate about what they do, but they have a bit of an ownership issue. They don't want somebody else coming in and helping them in any way, almost, you know. And yet we know with small groups, one of the problems is that you get 2 or 3 or half a dozen people get together, develop a group, but they all get older or get, you know, tired or fight with each other or whatever. And if the group disappears, then all the work they've done is disappeared down the drain. And one of my favorite sort of sayings is, look, if we're not still supporting this and maintaining this in 100 years' time, we might as well pack up now, because the rats and the stoats and the possums will be back. You know, the weeds will be back, the pampers will be back. You have to keep on top of it all the time. It's got to be an ongoing thing. It can't be about ownership. It can be about, yeah, hey, look, this is a pretty nice place that we've managed to make. But you know, this is for this. We've done this for everybody, not just for us. And it may give you personal satisfaction what you've done. And I certainly get a lot of satisfaction at seeing some of the work we've done at Moe's. You know, where we were this morning on the Dotterel Point at Pukahina, that was just a bare wave wash beach 7 or 8 years ago, and we put a fence up around it, and we've now got a 3 to 4 meter sand dune covered in spinifex and pingo there. And that's, you know, that was just literally from putting a fence up. And it just shows what relatively simple things can do to change the equation, but we need to do that on a much bigger scale is the trouble. And that, again, we come back to education. And one of the things at Makatū Natural Wetland Society and with Bay Conservation, we have really strong education programs. And it's really nice to see, you know, we get a lot of support from the philanthropic groups in the Bay and also from Western Bay Council for the education. And we see, you know, that and also with Bay Conservation, we've got the cadet program that really is, that's sort of taking people on a stage further from just the understanding and appreciating the environment to actually being in a position to maybe work in it and to actually do some good.
So in terms of, do you see then that the significance of education being critical to having that longevity beyond just individual organisations? And when I talk about longevity, the longevity of the commitment to improve and enhance biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, I think education is crucial because and it just staggers me actually that we have to do a lot of the environmental education in this country is done by community groups really working with schools. Why is the Ministry of Education not in there? Isn't the environment one of the most important things? Isn't climate change the biggest issue of for the coming generations? I mean, it just staggers me. It's a bit like, you know, why on earth were we not learning New Zealand history until next year? You know, that's quite extraordinary. I sometimes wonder what are the children learning at school if they've got no environmental education and no history. I'm not quite sure what they, you know, the 3 hours are all very well, but I think you need that hands-on stuff. And it is to me, it seems to me that we need not just that, you know, we need a change in the appreciation at all levels in society, and that's got to be education with a small e, you might say, but just at all levels, that we need to have an environmental understanding, which we don't have. I mean, I think, you know, for instance, I think all councillors on regional councils, sorry, I think I just hit a button. You know, when a councillor becomes elected a councillor, there ought to be an environmental education session. I'm sure there's lots of things about procedures and protocols, but do they learn anything about their environmental responsibilities, and particularly with something like a regional council? But in fact, all councils, the district councils as well, and city councils, they've all got to deal with the environment, and yet there isn't an appreciation in there, I don't think, amongst the governing sector of what we've got to do. So we've got to hit the governing sector as well, and we've got to hit the sort of the school sector, but we've got to also in between make sure that everybody is always aware the environment needs to be the #1 consideration, because we all depend upon it. If we lose our environment, if we ruin our environment, then it's going to be bad for everybody.
So you touched on climate change just before. So I'd be interested in terms of any comments you might have about the ecosystems and species that might be particularly affected in terms of climate change.
Yeah, well, I think obviously there's there are a couple of things there. In a general sense, any species which has a limited range, natural range, needs a very specific environment. You know, a bit like, for instance, the dotterel that nest on the coast here. You know, they pretty much need a place like that. They don't like nesting anywhere else. If the coast disappeared, you know, where would they go? What would the new coastline look like? I honestly don't know. And I don't think anybody really knows. For instance, you know, the sand spits we have, we you know, the Bay of Plenty is a very large sand beach. We don't really know, with a few entrances in between, you know, where the harbors empty out into the rivers, empty out into the sea. Nobody really knows how those areas are going to react to sea level rise. And it's going to be very interesting, because there's a bit of the coast centered on Matamata, which is not rising as fast. Which is actually rising so that the sea level rise is not affecting it as much. So it's going to be quite interesting to see if there are any, you know, there ought to be some studies going on to see how what's going on the coastal areas, in the areas like Matata and compared with Tauranga or Whakatane, where there isn't that coastal uplift going on. So I think, you know, that's those. Any species which has a relatively limited or a specific area that it likes to live in, you know, and you think of ones that live high up in the mountain, high in the alpine areas, they've obviously got a problem, because we may lose the alpine areas. You know, as we warm, that the snow line will creep upwards all the time. And so with sea level rising, we've got a lot of danger there and you know, species are going to be pushed inland and upwards, and we can get a bit of an idea, but I don't think nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, because the environment, the ecosystem is so complex, and we've made such a mess of it in places that it's very difficult to see exactly how that's going to, you can say, right, we're going to put the water level up this much, but I don't know, I don't know, for instance, if Makatu's bit wasn't there, well, the water would be all the way up to State Highway 2. That because in a way that there's nothing really, you'd have to have a mega sea wall to protect everything, because you'd have waves bashing up against the stop bank and they wouldn't last very long. So that spit is really important in all sorts of ways, but it protects the coast. And if we lose those sand beaches which are protecting, and we're obviously, we're in danger of doing that to some extent, because people for some reason love building on sand. In spite of being told in the Bible not to, I think they've seen, but there is a thing. People want a sea view, and so that there is a risk attached to that. But if we damage our dune systems, they are a defensive system, and that's where the regional council, district council, Corongo City Council with Coast Care have done a magnificent job in getting people to understand. But there are still, you will go down any of the areas where we were, for instance, more in Pukahina, you'll see some householders have done a lot of work to protect, to plant up their their dune area with natives. Others have still got weeds and pretty plants there, and that will damage the whole area if we're not careful. We haven't really, we're not really appreciating and building it into our planning procedures, exactly what the liabilities are, the flood risks involved that are going to be increasing. I think I'm quite glad I'm not down in Gisborne today. They seem to be getting a real hammering. And that's going to be the sort of case that some places like Gisborne may become hit much worse than others. For whatever reason, because they just happen to get caught by those, when you've got a depression, gets stuck and just chucks the water against the ranges, the clouds against the ranges, boom. So trying to predict exactly what's going to be, what species are going to be affected by the climate change is really quite difficult, because we don't know precisely how that climate change is going to affect us or the weather systems, except we know they're likely to be bigger, stronger, colder, hotter. All the extremes are going to become more common.
So just perhaps now moving to a more sort of focused, some commentary around how you would see people or what agencies might need to do to encourage more biodiversity in our own backyards, in our own section or our own piece of paradise. And really interested in any of your thoughts you'd like to share with the audience on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I think I touched on it before about, what you look at what you have in your garden and trying to say, this is a garden. There are lots of things I could choose from. Am I choosing wisely? If you want to have native birds, then you do need to have more native species in there. But also you have to watch out that some of your plants may be quite invasive when they get out of the garden. So that seems to me to be a really important area that we need to, focus on specifically. Look at your garden and think about, it's not, it's not your patch. It's a bit of land that you've borrowed, you've leased for a period of time. So we have to start thinking a bit more about sort of leasehood rather than ownership, you might say, because we are going to move on. We're going to move to another house or another house, and somebody else will come in. And so we do need to, if we can start getting the conversation around trying to nativize your garden, that I think is a really good thing that you can do personally, very simply and inexpensively. And that will also, once you start doing that, that actually gives a more of a commercial incentive to the plant nurseries to start producing more native plants to plant in your garden. I mean, I've been looking around recently because we've been doing a bit of planting in the garden, and we can get some. It's quite difficult to get really good natives to go in the garden. There are a number of them, but they're often very miniature ones. I bet they seem to be like very small ones, which sometimes are quite good, but not. There aren't as many of the sort of bigger ones readily available. You can go to specialist nurseries as well, but if you go to the sort of Bunnings and Mitre 10 and things like that, they have a limited range of native plants there. And I think it would be, if there was more demand, and they will say, look, there's no demand, madam. If there's more demand, then they will more likely to start stocking a different variety of plants. So, and I think, you know, I had a sort of letter in the Listener recently, because they were talking about gardens, and it was very much what I described as the colonial garden. There's an idea that, you know, we've got to have your herbaceous border and your annual plants and all the rest of it. And I think I say, look, we need, can we not have an Aotearoa New Zealand garden? We've got the best array of plants of anywhere in the world. They may not be the same as the European ones or the Indian ones, but they're pretty nice. Let's start not looking at something purely in a sort of North European vein. Let's start being a bit more individual about it and say, right, you know, we've got this amazing variety of plant species in New Zealand. Let's make use of them. When we want to have an apple tree or a lemon tree or whatever, that's great. That's no problem at all. That doesn't change the basic idea that we ought to be doing more in our gardens, because it's the one thing we can do. Any house owner or house occupier with a garden can do is to help the native biodiversity is to start increasing and using native plants. And I personally find them really good. The one disadvantage I find with native plants is they keep on growing. And especially in this climate we have here, I've got 2 or 3 that are starting to cover the window, and I've got to go out this weekend and trim them back again. But very hard to stop them growing. But they are extremely good, and they are attractive, and they will bring the native birds and insects into your garden.
And really, the final question as part of the wrap up now. What would be your take-home message for our audience today?
I would say that it's up to all of us. It's not, you can't say, oh no, that's up to that group there, or that's Forest and Bird, or that's the Department of Conservation's job to do. The job is there for all of us to do. If we don't all join in, or the large majority join in, then we're not going to make it. We need to get that understood throughout the community, that this is something which will benefit all of us, and therefore it's a job worth doing, to try and improve the biodiversity. And by working together on that, EnviroHub is a good example of bringing people together as well. That working together makes the difference. It means we can actually, we can go and bang on the table and say, hey, look, we want this done, please, Mr. Politician or Mrs. Politician. This is what we think, and the community wants this, and politicians will respond. If they think the community wants something, if the opinion poll says the environment is the most important thing, far more important than housing or social services, if they think the environment is number 1, then we'll get more money for the environment. But if the environment is number 10, we're not going to get so much. So we do have to, you can't just ask the politicians say, why don't they put more money in? That's partly because we don't ask for it enough. We don't put it top of our list of things to do. And I always, Bill Clinton famously said, it's the economy stupid. I would say, actually, it's the environment stupid.
Well, on that note, thank you, Julian, for sharing your thoughts on the topic of biodiversity. I think just sort of picking up, obviously, some of the key themes or matters you've highlighted in your response to the range of questions. I think that individual responsibility, so that's at obviously the individual level, but I also clearly take note in terms of the need, to work together, but also in terms of thinking bigger and actually connecting up a range of groups. And that also then helps in terms of achieving that longevity, because any of these initiatives need to move beyond individual organisations or particular timeframes. So I think that's a clear messaging from today, but also then the role of the Waiariki Park region in actually helping that connection of the range of groups, and also hopefully connecting up in various ways the education and the significance of education, I think, Julian, underpins pretty much what you have outlined in today's session. So once again, thanks very much. Really appreciate, on behalf of EnviroHub, your contribution to this year's Speakers Forum. Thank you.
My pleasure, Bill. Thank you.
Like to introduce and welcome Allison Bentley. Alison has a small lifestyle farm on the outskirts of Rotorua, who was a strong advocate of small-scale farming for local communities. She has delved into food forests, organic beef, regenerative farming, and a hazelnut production trial in association with the Regional Council.
Great, thanks for that, Bill. So yeah, I'm Alison, and I've got a property in Rotorua, on the eastern side of Rotorua. I've got 7 hectares, which for me is the perfect size of land. It's in most conventional thought lines, it's not a farm. You know, the big farmers don't call it a farm, and yet the lifestyleists call it, you know, quite a large piece of property. I think on the scale of things, it can be very productive. At this stage, I'm not utilizing the land to its fullest potential because I'm still developing it. We moved here 8 years ago after we had spent far too long, in my opinion, living in town. But life is life is. I learnt lots from living in town, and we had a, you know, the average size town section, which I set about changing from camellias and hebes type garden into a food garden of its own right, and ended up with a plan to have 14 different fruiting plants and a whole lot of vegetables, etc. as well. So my beginnings are definitely from the land. I grew up in rural Te Puke, and so essentially have ended up not too far from where I started, having trotted overseas for a wee bit in between, as we do as young Kiwis. And so my grandparents had a big influence in the philosophies that I carry through today, as did my own parents. We grew up, I started on a sheep and beef farm with my family, and then Dad moved to a bare block of land and started a kiwi fruit orchard from nothing back in the day. But he himself always incorporated some diversity in what he was doing as well. So from a young age, I was a participant in Tree Crops Association field days, and helping Dad with cash crops during the establishment of his orchard. And today he carries on through a diversity theme in his kiwi fruit orchard, where he runs sheep in his orchard at strategic times of the year. He doesn't use herbicides and that sort of thing. So that's my background, coming from mainstream conventional, but still with that heart connected with the land and the environment and how it works together. We bought this piece of land, and we had been looking for quite some time, and I was quite specific in what I wanted, and there's only one tick box that didn't get fulfilled in buying this land, and that was having our own water source on our land, our own free-flowing water source, but we do have a bore pump for our water. The aspect of our land is gentle rolling, and it's north facing. We've got bore water, as I mentioned, and we've got solar panels that we grid tie, so that means that we're not completely off grid, that we do trade electricity with the grid, and that's kind of another bit of a story in itself. However, the power that we do make is used to run the bore pump and the electric fences, the reticulation of the water throughout our farm, as well as our domestic home. On the land itself, I'm running 3 major projects, and our domestic food system as well, of which is not continuous, but we get to that, we do our best. So the 3 projects are a hazelnut trial in partnership with Bay of Plenty Regional Council, and that's all about trialling hazelnuts as an alternative land use to reduce nitrogen loading in our waterways. So that's trialling to see if hazelnuts is a viable horticultural land use that does not involve animals. I do run beef on my property as well. I always have done, and I always will integrate some animal agriculture with my horticulture practices. And I also have just started growing trees in a bagged tree nursery kind of situation, and that primarily the idea for that is to supply the landscape industry, but through my farming connections, there's also a need for providing trees for farms, and that's becoming a very topical issue and something that the wider large farming community will need to be addressing. And so from my horticulture background, I can feed into assisting farmers in their needs and requirements there. So that's going to blend nicely with my farming experience and my horticultural knowledge and abilities to grow trees and provide some advice and service for farmers who need trees on farms. And then there is our own domestic food production that I have here for the family. Coming from a family who has always had vegetable gardening, my grandfather used to come up and help my mother when I was a child, and then I used to help my grandfather as well. So, and same with my husband, actually. My husband has a family history of growing their own food. So that was always very much a part of what we were going to do as a family growing up together with our 3 daughters. We started that in town, as I say, and that was one of the first things I did when we secured the purchase of this property, was to plan out the food paddock, which was directly associated to the house, so for easy access. And you know, things have to be convenient. If it becomes hard work, it's just going to be hard, and you're just not going to get there. One thing that I found with developing food gardens is the reliance that we have, probably the unconscious reliance we have on supermarkets. And developing a garden, you don't necessarily have all the food that you need all at the right times. So I've learnt to make a transition of initially going to the supermarket and then topping up from the garden, to now going to the garden and then topping up what I need from the supermarket. Planting and growing is one thing, and harvesting is another thing. Harvesting and utilising. So just because you can go and pick your beans for the meal tonight, or pull your carrots from the earth, that's really exciting and it's really neat to do. I kind of got a bit hung up for a while that that needed to be fresh and done the moment before I put her in the pot for the family meal. But in fact, kind of get over that a bit, and turned out to be much more efficient to go and harvest on a weekly kind of basis, or every few days, and harvest and put it in the fridge, so that when it did come to family meal times, it was in the fridge. and very easy to access, and throw a meal together. So I think one of the things that I've learned from my experience is not to be too hard on yourself. You are going to have huge successes, which is going to end up in excess food, and you're also going to have failures. But over time, that balances out, and hopefully you can preserve some of your excesses, and that helps to provide some nourishment for the family for the failed crops that you've had. And it's also really neat to work through the seasons when you're producing from home. And I mean, zucchinis is a classic. You just, by the time the summer's finished, you just don't want to see another zucchini. But coming out of winter, you're craving nothing more than zucchini fritters and all sorts of things that you can do with your fresh fruit and veggies. Take advantage of all learning that you can, but don't be hard on yourself. Do it the way that's practical and achievable for yourself. So with that small block of fruit trees that I put on, which consist of some citrus and some pears and some apples, an olive tree that was an existing tree, and what else have I got in there? Nectarines. Those are the main fruiting trees. And over time, and so I started off just by mowing around those, but over time, and I used the cut clippings strategically in the garden system as well. And then over time, I've kind of filled in the gaps, reduced the amount of grass and increased the amount of trees and perennial vegetables like rhubarb and things like that. So I'm starting to develop those layers of the food forest season by season, and I've made a strategy of doing that in a way that I can assist nature and nature can work for me. It does take longer. It is probably less expensive than going into a site and kind of developing the whole lot in one go from scratch, kind of go to you know, 0 to 100, I guess, in one season. So there is that weigh up between time and money as inputs. But I think in weighing that up, both options can still look to nature to best inform the mahi on which option you choose for developing your own food production system. Then over time, we looked at our property seasonally and discovered that there was one corner of the property that was slightly higher than the rest of the property, and it was on a slope with existing large shelter trees on the south and southwestern sides of this corner. So we've gone ahead and put in a small subtropical block in the corner of our Rotorua property, and we've planted 4 avocado trees, 4 macadamia trees. My beautiful daughter gave me a banana palm, so that's in there as well. This block I have developed differently. I've put sport trees in at the same time as my fruit trees. I've got some citrus up there. I've got tamarillos up there, and for the first season they're fruiting, so I'm really excited to go up and watch those change colour as they ripen into the winter. I've got some cider apple trees up there as well. And I've done it in such a way that I can graze the animals around the edge of it by using electric fencing. And I do know of 4 sites reasonably close to me around Rotorua that avocado trees are fruiting. So I know that it can happen by local knowledge, and I know from my horticulture knowledge that making the most of a climate ecosystem. Once again, working with nature, watch nature, see how it the characteristics of nature and work with that. You know, in other properties, there would be south-facing hollows where it's an environment for moist-loving plants, shade, cool root systems, damper environments. So have a look around your property, observe, take the time, watch nature season in and season out, and then develop accordingly to that. So that's kind of the bit about home food production and the overview of the property. So I run beef heifers. I buy them in as 100-kilo weaners, and I buy from local farmers. I have a stock agent that works really, really well with me, and he's on board with my vision and how I do things here. And so he helps me source animals from local farms. My dream has, for a long, long time, has been to supply meat to local people, so local for locals. It's been extremely difficult to be able to get to the point that I can now do that. And that is because mainstream conventional systems are set for large farmers. End of story, basically. However, there are some passionate people who have travelled this road before I have, and I've been fortunate enough to find a chink in the armour, as it were, and hook into a micro abattoir in Cambridge. So I can now send my animals to Cambridge and get them processed and vacuum packed into appropriate serving portions from a cutting spec that I've worked out with the butcher, and I can go and pick up that packed meat and bring it back to Rotorua, label it and retail it. And at this stage, it's very, very new enterprise, and I'm selling direct to consumers at this stage. I've also had the help of Brown Owl Organics, who I've been a member with for many, many years, contributing sometimes more than others. But, you know, local communities, local networks, the beauty of local for local is being able to support and tap into and support each other and each other's communities and supply systems to be able to get local food distributed through the local district. I'm very fortunate also to hook up with Hamish from the Volcanic Creamery on the other side of Lake Rotorua to myself. He's another example of local for local, and he hooks into various other food services in the local arena as well. So it has been a dream, it's been a long journey, there's been lots and lots of roadblocks, but you've just got to keep on pushing through. If you really want to achieve what you want to achieve, you've just got to keep pushing through. So that's what I've done. It's now kind of put me into the next level of motivation and passion that I have been able, it's kind of the beginning of the journey again, in that I can grow my beef, I can source my animals, I can farm them regeneratively, which I'm also very, very passionate about. And then instead of coming to the day when they have to leave the farm, you know, I used to get a real day of sadness when my animals had to leave the farm. Now I can take a whole lot of pride in that, knowing that that meat can come back and knowing that people can eat that meat with confidence that it has been farmed with care and consideration, very low food miles, and they can have a relationship with me as the farmer who can deliver their meat to them personally. the common term for how I farm is regenerative farming. I started farming this way long before that term came out. I farm generally to organic principles, the main principle there being no herbicides and no chemicals unless needed for animal health reasons. I'm moving more and more to non-chemical animal health assistance, but in a really well-functioning farm system, which includes and starts with actually the soil ecosystem itself, there's a huge reduction in need for animal health services, because the health is the food, the health is the ecosystem, the health of the animal comes from the ecosystem itself and how you're running your farming ecosystem. So biological farming was a term previously used. Ultimately, I'm organic regenerative because the terminology of the old biological farming, the thread of organic farming, the new term of regenerative, each of them have limitations, parameters, protocols, which don't always deliver really what I wanted. So I've taken the best out of each of those forums, I guess, and been my own farmer, which I must say I've followed in the footsteps of my father, who does things because that is right by the land, as opposed to being right by an industry. Observation is something very important in this way of farming. There is a skill in observation, and unfortunately I don't see a lot of that happening in our education system in the rural sector. A lot of education in the rural sector is textbook based. But when you start to be able to really observe what's happening on your farm, then questions pop up. And then you get quite, well, I get quite drawn into why is that happening? And then I seek answers from an ecological perspective. And as I've gone through my journey and more and more learning in this space of agriculture, the people that I'm learning most of have actually had ecology background, biodiversity background, much more so than agricultural science background. There's a lot of science that can feed into how we farm. A lot of science is really important, but it needs to be balanced, and observation is the balancing factor on the other end of the seesaw that contributes to being able to farm in such a way where the animals are happy, the ecosystem of the farm, which starts with the soil and goes to the grass, and that term grass actually is something I don't use very much these days because I have multi-species pastures. A lot of what is in my pastures is old seed bed for many, many years ago. I don't have a predominance of ryegrass and clover. Yes, I have ryegrass and clover, but I also have a lot of cocksfoot and brown top and a whole variety of other grass species, herbs and things in my pastures, which create the ecosystem for both the soil and the animals that are eating it. So with a wider variety of species in your pastures, you're going to get a wider variety of root structures, a wider variety of plants sourcing different nutrients and minerals from the soil, and therefore delivering those to the animals themselves. I'm very fortunate to belong to a farm field day group, which I've got to through my farming philosophy and connecting with like-minded people. And there are a number of field day groups throughout the country, all with varying different topics, motivations, drivers, thought processes. So I belong to one that focuses on regenerative agriculture. Attending farm field days is an awesome opportunity to learn how other farmers are doing it. It's an awesome opportunity to connect with other farmers about the wins and the struggles. But like the home veggie garden, you're going to have some really good wins and you're going to have some real challenges. And by being able to discuss these with other like-minded farmers, is really supportive and really encouraging, and we bounce off each other and we learn heaps off each other, and we go to each other's different properties, all of which have their own unique challenges, topography, aspects, goals and aspirations for the farmers themselves. But that's, you know, adding the variety once again. Variety is the spice of life, and working with people, working with animals, working with plants, observing, learning, trying, practicing, having failures, which really aren't failures, they're just another opportunity to learn, getting things right, having wins, being able to share that, is pretty much the basis of what motivates me. And now being able to supply my local meat to local consumers has really closed the loop and has given me another punch of motivation to keep going and continue to do what I'm passionate about. On the topic of climate change, this is huge and sometimes quite controversial, I think, when we've got believers and non-believers and evangelists and small people and big people, and it's just a huge melting pot. But let's just scale it down to what we can do ourselves. So I'll talk a little bit now about what I'm doing and how I think it kind of fits with world scale. So I come from a horticultural background, but agriculture is where I've merged into. My principles, my life principles really, are to tread a can within the society and the community that we live in. Treading lightly can be a challenge in itself, particularly living rural. Just the mere fact, I would love to have an e-bike, but I don't, because I'm 20 k's out of town and I can't go and pick up farm supplies on an e-bike. It just doesn't work. So we all do, well, I do what I can do to contribute my best foot forward. So in my farming practices, the way I farm with conscious decisions about treading lightly and reducing my impact to a negative climate change. I try and do things to positively contribute to limiting climate change to the best of my ability. I see that regenerative farming and the way that I do it is a big part of that. my horticultural background comes into this quite heavily, in that I do love trees. There's no doubt about that. I understand the environmental integration of trees in our personal lives and in the natural environment that we live in. So every winter season, I plant more and more trees on my farm. When we came to this property, we had a lot of big old pine trees on the farm. We set about harvesting those off and using those as a resource to fund our solar system that we've got. It is grid tied, we're not off grid. That's another greater goal that I have, to contribute more to a lighter impact on the earth. But at this stage, we can't quite reach that full goal. So we've gone to the extent that we can at this point, and that's grid tied solar. But by cutting down those big old pine trees, it has allowed me to farm a whole lot more efficiently. It's allowed me to plant a native mixed species block on a hillside that was once a monoculture of pine trees. With that block of natives developing over the years, we're seeing a whole lot more bird life. I'm planting more trees throughout the paddocks of my animal farming situation, and this provides a greater ecosystem for both the pasture and the animals. I'm planting trees that provide fodder for bees, so nectar and pollen for bees. They provide shelter for the animals. I choose trees quite carefully so that it's not limiting the grass growth part of the animal operation. And in fact, the trees that I plant contribute to the animals' diet. They can graze on the trees as they wish to an extent, so that they don't kill the trees. But consideration must be put into what species of trees that we plant for that purpose. I do not cultivate, and that might come as quite a shock to some of the larger farmers, but there are plenty of farmers around the world now, large-scale farmers that are well and truly underway with no-till farming practices, which means they're not turning the soil. Every time we turn the soil, we are releasing carbon, we are destroying ecosystem habitat for our soil microorganisms. We are opening up the soil to erosion by both wind and water. So no-till, no-cultivation is definitely a principle that I farm by. It is scalable. That principle is definitely scalable to very, very large farms and to smaller lifestyle blocks than myself. So how can lifestyle blocks, smaller pieces of land, fit into the puzzle of Waiariki Park? Really importantly, it's a really, really important part. Going forward, it's going to take quite a mind shift, I think. And I think this is where our mind shift needs to actually look at some of the rest of the world, and looking at how productive small farms can be. There's a difference between lifestyle blocks and small farms only by thought process. If we look out to the greater world right now, there's a statistic that goes something like small farming systems produce 50% of our food calories on 30% of our agricultural land. I think as the world goes forward, looking at our own backyard is going to be more and more important, which is why I've pushed so hard to be able to produce local beef for local consumption. When we talk about the world, let's think about our own Waiariki Park. Think about our own immediate world. Think about our neighbours. Think about our region. We are only restricted by our imagination, by attitudes and mindsets that believe something different. Having a diversity within our Waiariki Park in climate and soil gives us a huge opportunity for our smaller land holdings to contribute to our local food system. So yeah, that touches, scratches the surface really on how I am trying to do my bit on my little piece of land to leave the world in a better place. I strongly believe that sometimes we feel very lonely in what we're doing on our own little piece of land, which is where being part of the Regenerative Farmers Field Day group that I belong to is really, really good. Also participating in world forums that we can now with our online mahi and kororo, we can be part of a greater picture and we can get greater support. So it's very easy to feel like we are a drop in the ocean in what we're doing in our own backyard, and sometimes we really think, why am I going to this effort? There's a whole world out there. My little bit's not going to really actually do much, but it does a huge amount. If you think you are a drop in the ocean, you think about all the properties around our own rohe, our own country, and then the world at large. Each drop in the ocean makes the ocean. That's the difference.